Saving starts with internet and wireless from Xfinity. Because when you get Xfinity Internet and add mobile, you can save up to $400 a year on wireless. Enjoy fast, reliable internet at home and nationwide 5G on the go, included at no extra cost. Get Xfinity Internet and mobile together and ask how to get an eligible 5G phone on us. And for a limited time, $300 back. Don't miss out. Go to Xfinity.com/start saving. Call 1-800-XFINITY or visit a store today. Restrictions apply. Savings based on optimized pricing. Actual savings may vary.
Hey guys, we're using Poshmark and you should too. Do you have things that you don't wear anymore? Poshmark is seriously the easiest way to make room in your closet, make some cash, and also snag a bargain. It's the coolest reseller with the best brands like Lululemon, Nike, Reformation, and Gucci for up to 70% off. DJ Khaled has a closet and Serena Williams. Download the app today. Enter Podcast 10 when you sign up for $10 off your first purchase on Poshmark.
Attention all personnel. It's MASHcast.
Hello and welcome to MASHcast, the show that analyzes and celebrates, episode by episode, the greatest TV series of all time, MASH, which aired on CBS from 1972 to 1983. Proud member of the Fire and Water Podcast Network. I'm your host, General Robert Iron Guts Kelly. And joining us this week in the VIP tent is returning VIP, General Scott X. Hi, Scott.
Hey, it's very good to be back with you, General Kelly. You know, I've been rotated back into the 407-7th. I'm sure I'll have to ship out again shortly, but I'm glad to be here while I can.
I am very happy to have you back. You are wrapping up season 4. Now, you wrapped up season 3 of MASHcast with me last year, so you're like my own personal Buck Henry. You're like the guy we bring in at the end of the season. So I'm very happy to have you here to talk about one of the landmark episodes of MASH of all time. Of course, it's season 4, episode 24, The Interview. The original air date was February 24th, 1976, written and directed by Larry Gelbart, his last episode of MASH. Talk about going out with a bang.
Absolutely.
So Scott, since you've been on the show before, we can get right to the synopsis as it is. A war correspondent, Cleet Roberts, has brought a camera crew to the 477 to interview the men and women of the unit and to record their thoughts and experiences. Hawkeye is his anti-establishment best, mocking the Army and its discipline, even cursing at one point right on film. He also propositions Best Truman. Klinger talks about the delights of home. BJ talks of missing his family. Colonel Potter talks about what it's like being in command and being so much older than everyone else in camp. Radar mentions his hobbies. Father McCahey talks about how much being here has changed him, and Frank is his usual hardline, pro-war, pretend patriotic self. When asked if the war has changed him in any way, he answers, certainly not, amazed at the question. Colonel Potter discusses his career in the military, but admits that whatever medical advances are made in the war, it is not worth all the destruction, the loss of life, the waste. When asked if anything of value will come from this war, Potter bluntly answers, not a damn thing. Hawkeye, BJ, and Colonel Potter make an extra effort to praise the nurses and how hard they work. Frank describes them as competent. When asked about heroes, Hawkeye says he doesn't have any. Colonel Potter offers up Abraham Lincoln and Harry Truman. In the end, Hawkeye is at a loss for words as how to describe what it's like being here, what they have to do, and war itself. It's crazy. So that is the interview. And obviously the description I've given it is sort of bare bones because this episode, kind of similar to the earlier season episode Hawkeye, it really is just one long conversation across the different cast members, sans Margaret, of course, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But nevertheless, this is just, no, I don't think anybody argues, this is one of the greatest MASH episodes of all time, probably even one of the greatest single episodes of any TV show ever done. Would you agree with that, Scott?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and you had mentioned too that, you know, how Larry Gelbart, one of the series creators, went out with a bang with this one, without a doubt. And it was a unique episode, but still one that people, certainly watching the mid-'70s, would have been very familiar with. And you and I have talked about this, and I know you and other guests have, about how MASH was set in the Korean War, reflecting back on World War II, but really talking about the Vietnam War. And I can't help but the format they used for this episode sort of hit all those. And how it really was brought home to who would have been the viewership, certainly at that time. And I still think it's like that. When I watch this, I think right away of a newsreel. Yep. You know, that you would have seen at that time before a movie. The black and white. And I should mention that, too, that it was done in black and white. which was the only one of the series that was done that way. And I like how they announced at the beginning of the episode, they said, this episode is in black and white.
Following is in black and white.
Yeah. So people didn't think their TV was broken. For all you youngsters out there, that kind of stuff did happen back then where, your color may have just dropped out and you didn't know the difference. I think, I know in 2017, Hulu actually had the episode in color.
It was very strange when I first saw it. I was like,
yes.
Wait, what?
And I saw in 2019, I think it was, they withdrew it and replaced it with the black and white version, which to me, the black and white works so much better for the format and the structure of this particular episode.
Oh, completely. I mean, Larry Gelbart in the 30th anniversary special, which is like one of my favorite things, he talks about the phrase he used, and this is a phrase that I borrowed in other contexts, where he says he felt that the interview episode was artful in its artlessness. Which I think is just a great way of describing it, in that it seems to be very blunt and no frills, as you mentioned. With the black and white, the sort of bare bones text, the hard edits. There's like these kind of, it's the kind of edits you would never see in a fictional television show because it would be considered too jarring. But of course, it's meant to seem like it's documentary footage. And, for those of you too young to remember, not that I remember the Vietnam War, I was just a child when it was still happening. But if you go back and look at some of the footage coming from the Vietnam War that was making it over to American televisions in the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of it was in black and white, even though most television had switched over to color at that point. Documentary footage and footage shot on the run like that was still a lot of ways in black and white. So as you're talking about, Scott, yes, the show is ostensibly about Korea, but it's really about Vietnam or all war in general. And so while this format had to be jarring for the average TV viewer because they're used to seeing everything in color, and the credits for this episode are in color, nevertheless, it had to be like, whoa, all of a sudden you feel like you're watching the news now because you're looking at everybody in black and white. And it really works. It just works so beautiful. I would love to know whose idea that was, whether it was Gelbart's.
It was Gene Reynolds.
It was Gene Reynolds?
It was Gene Reynolds. Gene Reynolds said in an interview that he had seen some of Edward R. Murrow's footage from when he went, and I heard Gelbart had said this in an interview I saw too. It was based on when Edward R. Murrow went to Korea and basically did this sort of thing during the actual Korean War. And Reynolds said, well, we saw it. And I said, well, there's an episode for us. And they just kind of put it in a box. And then at the end of season 4, the first three seasons, had been 24 episodes. And the network asked for an extra episode, this 25th episode. So they said, well, let's pull this one. And then that's what they used.
Huh. Because it's interesting. I always wonder how they count those things, because I count this as the 24th episode, because to me, Welcome to Korea is one show.
One show, yeah.
But I mean, I guess if you're producing the shows, it has to count as 2 because you want to get credit. You want to get not to be mercenary, but you want to get paid for that, because you're doing twice as much work. So I can understand that. Yeah, technically, this is a 25th episode of the season.
Well, and it's funny how you count it too, because when Reynolds said it, he said in his interview they wanted an extra episode, a 25th episode. When I heard Gelbart say it, he said a 23rd episode. We had 22, which again, how the numbers are, if people are forgetting later on, I don't even know. But you're right. You count it as 1 2-part episode, or is it a 2 episodes that are tied together? I don't know.
Yeah,
different creatively versus production, I'm sure too.
Yes. Oh, I can remember, when I was really kind of getting deep into the MASH fan. We're getting off the interview a little bit, but it's relevant in that I remembered reading some articles where they would say MASH did 257 episodes, and I've always known it to be 251. And I was like, wait, are there 6 MASHes I've never seen? Like, what are we talking about? And then I realized, they're talking about the hour-longs count as 1 or 2 or 3. But initially I was like, wait, there's 6 shows I haven't seen. No. It's all the way how it's counted. So, again, it opens with Cleet Roberts, who was a real newsman. He's a real, he's not playing himself.
I like how they didn't even name him in the credits. They just called him the interviewer.
He's the interviewer. Yes.
Yeah.
As a relevant again to another one of my interests, there is if you're a fan of him, relatively famous press conference that Bob Dylan did in the early 60s where, and for, again, not to get too far off field of that, but like off the interview. But in the early days when Bob was being interviewed, reporters were pretty contentious with him because a lot of interviewers were older and they were being sent to interview this guy who, kind of lied through interviews and was and there's one interview with Dylan where Clete Roberts is there.
Oh, wow.
And I remember that I knew Clete Roberts from his voice from this episode.
Yes.
So I'm watching this interview with Dylan and you don't see Clete Roberts, you hear his voice. And I just went, what? And I was like, that's Clete. And then they show him for a second. And it's the only time in history that two of my fandoms will ever overlap.
I was just going to say, and there you have.
So they're all tied.
Which is great.
Yeah, I was very excited about that. So I also love, so the episode opens right after the introduction with Clete Roberts. I love the detail of some of their saltier comments have been deleted.
Yeah. Well, in Clete Roberts' voice, he's like saying that as he's narrating it or whatever too. Like,
yeah, it's just marvelous. Again, it just gives that verisimilitude of like, yeah, well, some of these guys, probably talk a little salty. Of course they do. Of course, we know who they're talking about. It's not Radar. It's not Frank. It's not Colonel Potter. It's going to be Hawkeye and me.
And we should add here too. In this episode, there was no laugh track,
right?
And no music, so it was diegetic sound only. Occasionally, you'd be hearing the interviews. Occasionally, you'd hear a chopper in the background, or maybe a Jeep driving by. But again, all the sound was coming from the story itself, which again I just thought worked so well here for the structure of this particular episode. And
of course, the shots never change. And
right.
The way we were introduced to any of the characters, that's the shot we're getting.
Yep.
Throughout this episode. It doesn't. Hawkeye's in the mess tent. Radar's in his office. Klinger is in the kitchen. BJ is in some sort of scrub room. Frank is in the swamp. Colonel Potter is in his office. Father Mulcahy is in his tent. And again, it gives it that. I can imagine some people might say, can we give this a little more visual life? But of course, you don't want to give it more visual life. You want it to look like it looked like. They just sat them down and recorded the reactions of these people. And so we should mention too the format of this, in that Larry Gelbart wrote the questions that Clete Roberts was going to ask the cast members, and then he gave them to the actors, and the actors were then, it was incumbent on them to come up with answers in the style of their character. Now, of course, Gelbart would go back in and probably massage their answers a little bit, because none of these people, well, except for Alan Alda, none of these people were professional writers. But nevertheless, that's an extraordinarily brave bit of filmmaking, to just hand over a good chunk of your episode to your actors and hoping that they're going to come up with something interesting, different, unique. I mean, but that's an extraordinary level of trust you're showing in your actors. But of course, MASH had one of the best casts of any television show ever had.
Well, and you had said Gelbart. I saw an interview with him, and he said exactly what you said. They sort of wrote things out. He said he polished some of their responses. He said, then he laughed. He said, I don't know if I made them better or worse. But then during rehearsals, he had Clete Roberts say, now ask some questions that we haven't given to them. And then they had to, again, improv again. And then they did a third time while they were actually filming. He again asked them questions they had not heard before. So it was you'll see some of those in there where there's like these pauses before they answer. And I assume those are the ones where they then improv live during filming. And Gelbart said, this was a unique thing. He said, we didn't actually have a script until after the program was over. We wrote the script afterward based on what the show was. And then he said exactly what you did. He said, it was an amazing piece of faith from the company, from the network, for our show to put it into our hands. They didn't have a script to approve or disapprove or whatever else. We did the show, and then the script came out. So they had a lot of faith by that time in the show, in the creators, in the actors, and they hit it out of the park as far as I'm concerned.
That did not even occur to me till he just said that. Of course, because of the way it was written, they couldn't submit it to the network first, which is unheard of. That's completely unheard of. Good luck trying to pass that nowadays. That's amazing. Exactly. That's here, just trust us that the show is going to work right. Because what happens if it doesn't? Then you got no final episode of the season.
Yeah.
Man, that's unbelievable. So Hawkeye talks about how everything is painted green. Initially, he talks about everything except for the vegetables. And then he says the blood isn't green. You get a lot of that over here. And we see that later on, and we'll get to it, but like Hawkeye, he kind of toggles back and forth between performing for Clete Roberts and performing for the camera, because if he's aware that the camera is on him. And at the same time, he's also being very blunt. Like he seems very kind of disinterested in making this seem fun. I mean, of course he does, but like he kind of goes back and forth between having fun and kind of making jokes and trying to be entertaining. And he even references that he feels like it's sort of like a service that he provides. And then also just being very direct, which again, I find that interesting that Hawkeye sort of takes that tack. Now, Radar talks about his initial comment is he says one of the tough things about being in the 477th is the wooden latrine seats, which you get splinters, and he says you can't really reach around and take them out yourself. Boy, that's when you find out where your friends really are. Which is
right. And then he says too, can I say latrine on TV? Well, let's give it a try.
Yeah, let's find out.
Let's find out.
He's wonderful. He's very fatherly with Radar.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So then you get Burns, and he says, I don't see what's wrong with ordering doctors to behave as patriotically as possible. And of course, Clete Roberts says, doesn't patriotism have to come from the heart? And Frank says, I don't have that problem. And I mean,
Frank's bits were hysterical to me.
Oh,
because they were so deadpan, but they were so hysterical because they were so frank, where he just doesn't have a clue.
Oh, in the modern parlance, they are nothing but cell phones. They're just yeah. He has no idea what he's saying and how it makes him sound like a complete jackass.
Yes, exactly. Again,
oh man,
typical Frank. Yeah.
Typical Frank. So then you get BJ, and BJ has a very interesting observation, which I like because. We know that Hawkeye, everyone here is a doctor, but Hawkeye being Hawkeye sort of dominates the conversation. And we know, as we've talked about in previous episodes, they specifically mentioned in like The More I See You, that Hawkeye is among doctors, first among equals. Everybody at the 477th, except for Frank, is a great doctor, but Hawkeye's a little bit better than the rest of them because he's like gifted. He's beyond just a great doctor. He's sort of preternaturally gifted. And so, most of the time, when MASH really wanted to confront a medical issue of like morality, they would kind of give it to Hawkeye to kind of be the point man on that sort of issue. But there's a line here that BJ gets where he says, you have to understand, I'm not working on sick people. I'm working on hurt young people with essentially healthy bodies that have been insulted by ammunition. And first of all, I love that phrase, insulted by ammunition. But I like that BJ sort of makes that moral distinction, saying, I'm not a typical doctor where I'm working on someone with a disease or an affliction or a whatever. I'm working on someone who's normally considered healthy, except part of their body's been ripped away by artillery. And that is and for someone of BJ's feelings about being a healer and a member of the medical community, that again, the phrase "insulted by ammunition" to me is just a great turn of phrase.
And it was, I found it interesting too how when he mentioned, he kind of, and I'm going to just kind of distill down what he said, but about you may be a specialist, but your specialty is everything.
Yeah,
I mean, you're an orthopedist, and he said we're a psychologist most days,
pretty much all the time. Yeah,
pretty much all the time. Because there's so many different things that come in. We don't have the luxury of having a specialist for every single thing that comes in here, because there's just too many things that come in here too quickly all at once.
Yeah, Father Mulcahy then talks about that he has the corner market on being the chaplain. He says I don't mind. I don't pack them in, but that doesn't bother me. And he says there aren't too many of us over here. We're spread a little thin, although they spread everything over here. I mean, it makes sense for Father Mulcahy to say that, but at the same time, you're like, we already know how few people go to Father Mulcahy's services. So why would they ever need a second person at MASH that does this?
I kind of felt like he was almost lamenting the fact that there wasn't a need for a second person because of what you just said, but trying to frame it in a way that didn't sound like that, which I liked. How he approached that.
Yeah. Colonel Potter asks about, he's asked about, does everyone here see you as a father figure? And he says, I suppose they do. That gets to be a pain in the beep too.
Yeah.
It's just, and I love it. He goes, excuse me. It's
Yeah.
just great. And it's so funny that the saltier comments have been deleted. The first salty comment does in fact come from Colonel Potter.
Right, exactly.
Hawkeye. It's just very funny. I mean, look, everybody here does a great job, but I mean, there's something, Harry Morgan
I totally
really
agree.
brings it.
I wrote the same thing in my notes, that I thought his bits, like I said, where I said Frank's were hysterical, his overall were just, he just nailed it.
Yeah.
He just nailed that fatherly commanding officer, and having been sort of an old war horse, and
Yep.
his how he emoted in his facial expressions without it always coming through in his voice, but it did come through in his voice too on occasion. You know,
Yeah.
it was really well done.
Yeah, he has this very world weary tone to him.
Yes,
which is perfect. And he's sort of, again, it's like Hawkeye in that he's him and Hawkeye. I mean, I don't know. They're all aware of the camera, of course, but it feels like Potter and Hawkeye are the most kind of aware of that they're being filmed and that this is going to be seen by people, and they seem to take. Again, like they toggle back and forth between talking to Clete Roberts and forgetting the camera's there, and then actually being very aware of like, okay, yeah, there is an audience here that's watching this.
Yeah.
And then Klinger talks about Klinger is. I love the way sort of Jamie Farr presents, characterizes Klinger here, in that Klinger is still essentially kind of a happy-go-lucky guy.
Yep.
And all of his memories are about the great stuff that he has back home, and and he talks about Tony Pacos, and
that makes our first of 6 or 7 appearances. We hear Tony Pacos.
Yeah, Tony Pacos' greatest Hungarian hot dogs with chili peppers, 35 cents, and a cold beer. Like he's so excited. Like
Stroh's
Bohemian and Alverso cigars. Like he's doing a bunch of advertisements for people, but it's really charming because you were like, that's where he is. He's still back in Toledo enjoying all those things.
And I found it interesting, and again, sort of it is the production choices too. But Klinger was Klinger. He wasn't wearing the female garb. He was not putting on the show about trying to get out of the army. Which, of course, if it was a real interview, that all would have been cut. Of course,
he would never appear.
That would never have flown and made it past the military censors. But I like that too. That we got to see Klinger, like you said, as Klinger, the happy-go-lucky. It was his person, who he was.
And it's almost that's the way Klinger deals with being at war. Is his body is in Korea, but his mind is in Toledo.
Yes,
and that's what he talks about.
Absolutely.
I mean, he will comment on some other things about what's actually going on there, but he really is. Again, he's so enraptured with his town. And so Radar talks about his earthworms, raising his earthworms. I love it. He says. They need a lot of dirt. Is this too technical?
yeah.
Roberts is like, no. It's fine. He's just very nice about it. And then he talks about the cockroaches that he's got, and then that leads back to Colonel Potter, and it leads again to one of my favorite exchanges where he says, is there developments in the way of medical or technical developments? And then Potter says, yeah, well, there are some things that get a practical trying out here that you wouldn't do back home. But he says when you counterbalance the frightful, and by the way, frightful is a wonderful term. Frightful expense, the frightful destruction, the loss of life. I don't think it's an equal balance. And you get Clete Roberts saying, "Do you see anything good coming out of this?" And Potter, without a hesitation, just goes, "Not a damn thing." And then he catches himself looking in the camera like he's mad at himself that he let it slip that much. Yeah. But I love that. That's his honest reaction. Not a damn thing. And it's just really marvelous.
And that's the interesting kind of juxtaposition there. I think Klinger mentions it too about, you back home call this a police action.
Yeah, over here.
As if we're out here writing tickets and, pulling people over. But what's going on here is killing. Yeah. It's war,
He says war is just killing. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just again, that's something else that they would hit on in later seasons of Klinger, that Klinger's objection to being at war is he doesn't want to kill anybody. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want to be involved in killing. There's an episode in season 6 where he talks to Sidney Friedman where he says, I don't want to be around when someone is killed, and I don't want to be the one doing it, and forget it. If somebody makes me do it, forget it. That's it. I'm done. And I like that that's Klinger's moral objection. It's not so much one of fear, which would be completely understandable anyway.
Or political.
But it is a moral, it almost is like a conscientious objector kind of thing where he's like, I just don't want to be involved in the killing of people in any way. And I like that he has that distinct take on it, as opposed to some of the other people. We know Frank, who's perfectly happy with all the death and destruction that are around him. So then Hawkeye talks about, getting bombed, getting hit, and he says, "Oh yeah, they bombed the crap out of us a number of times. The beams shake and the dust falls in your patient, and it's not nice." And then he talks about fear, and it's one of the few times that they actually do sort of like a push-in, where he says sometimes the beginning of the night, sometimes before dawn, and you wake up and you realize that you're not sleeping, and you realize it's because the cot is shaking. And he says you start to realize when you think about where you are and what could happen to you. It's a great monologue of Hawkeye's in that, when you think about how you're sitting somewhere that could be bombed at a moment's notice, and you'd never know it. I mean, hospitals aren't supposed to be bombed, but they do. Right. They have gotten bombed. And think about all you're sitting in is a canvas tent a couple of miles away from where bombs are falling. And it's like, I mean, at some point you have to get used to it, but what a terrifying thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And, they have their fear for their own safety while they're trying to protect the health and safety of the people that are brought to them because they were injured or whatever during the actual combat. They're not supposed to be in combat, but they are still on the edge of combat.
Yeah. It's
how do you separate that at some point?
Yeah. Clete Roberts asks Hawkeye, how do you have morale? How do you keep your morale up? And he says, you really don't have morale here. What do you have? Pure survival instinct? Yes. And then he does that bit about where everyone has that glazed look. And he says, everyone has their own problems, which makes me think of the time that Hawkeye walked naked in the mess tent, because him and Trapper were having the argument about that. Nobody will notice. Everybody's a cipher. Everybody's zoned out. And so I feel like that's a reference to that, where it's like he's doing this to kind of just, as he says, I think he refers to himself as like what Bob Hope, Burton Burl does for people.
Right.
They just can't believe it,
Yeah.
Which I think is great. I love the idea that he's looking at it like it's a public service. So then Frank gets asked, well, has this whole experience changed you in any way? Certainly not.
He shakes his head. How could it not? I mean,
what a ridiculous question you're asking me.
Yeah, exactly.
So then Hawkeye talks about, there's so much more here to care about. And then he says, on the other hand, I really don't give a bleep what happens. I just don't care anymore. And then he has another great line where he says, I have seen so many people to whom killing is a casual thing. And the line is, he says, I don't know how we manufacture people like that, but it seems like we'll never run out of them. And I mean, we're living with that today. We're living with that right now. I will admit, like on my Twitter feed, I will find a certain strain of person that I just block automatically because they're awful. And I will admit, after like the 50th person in a row who's awful, I get tired because I'm just like, God, how many are these people there? How many more of these people? How many more people, insulting Simone Biles can I tolerate? You know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
It's like, God, we don't run out of these people, But I just love the turn of phrase. I don't know how we manufacture people like that. And he's sort of saying, as an American society, how do we keep cranking out people like this? It's sort of like a collective. It's like it takes a village kind of thing, saying we're all at fault to a certain extent that we're creating people like this. And just the idea of a manufacture, which brings up the image of cars on an assembly line. And it's I have to assume that's Alan Alda's line.
Right.
And it's just fantastic.
Yeah. And again, that's something I think that is so interesting. Again, I wish I knew which things were the scripted, which were the improv, which were the second improv, because I find all that fascinating.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That'd be great to know.
And how they're doing it in their character, but their real person seeps into their character as as any show that's ran as long as this did, they're who they are informs their character, and then their character begins to inform them. I think as people too, when you're seeing these things and thinking about these things and how would they respond and how would I respond and how is it written and what's going on in the world and all. Again, this episode I just can't rave about it enough because it hits all of those points. I mean, it really hits them all.
Yeah, I would imagine you're playing a character every day for some of these people, 8, 9, 10, 11 years. How does it not start seeping back into your personality? I mean, I
asked an historian one time who I have great respect for, and we were talking about, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but the so-called ephemera, like when you have wood carvings or photographs of war and images like this. And we were talking about, well, what did people do with these when they bought these, whether it be the 19th century or the 20th century? And then my question was, well, when they're put out in the public media, are they influenced by the public opinion or do they influence the public opinion? Because they're obviously trying to sell something. People aren't going to buy what they don't want to see. But at the same time, when you see certain images, like an interview like this would be, it can't help but influence your thoughts on that event either. And of course, the answer is it's both. It influences and it's influenced by.
Yes.
And I think the same thing with sort of this acting. When you're thinking about these in a certain way, it can't help but work both ways.
Yeah, completely. Father Mulcahy has. He gets probably the least amount to say in the show, but he gets one of the most memorable lines where he talks about when it's cold and the doctor will open a patient and the steam rises from the body. And he says the doctor will warm himself over the open wound. And then he begins to sort of tear up and he says, can anyone look at that and not feel changed? As we know, that line is real. That's from a surgeon that Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds interviewed, where that literally happened, and they just took that line and gave it to Father Mulcahy.
And that one is often cut in syndication.
Jeez.
And I always think that. I know it's got to be hard to choose what to cut in syndication, but to me, that is one of the lines of this episode. Is that because that's so? It is metaphorically and literally visceral.
Yeah.
Couldn't
cut the stuff about the earthworms, maybe? Like, really?
Right, exactly.
Come on. What are you doing? And that's the act break to the show. That's the end of the first act. And then we come back, and then Hawkeye has another bit about I love the bit about so many people thought they could tell me what to do. That was really surprising to me. I love that idea. I mean, people that easily fit into structures of power structures probably don't really have that idea in their head of isn't it interesting that there's a bunch of people who feel as though they can tell you what to do?
Well, and particularly in the military. The military is based on that.
Yeah. Follow
orders. And Colonel Potter makes a comment about that too. These are not soldiers.
Yeah, they're doctors.
They're doctors. And he makes a comment too about that. Not so much about following orders, but again about that structure and how they view things differently. And does he, as a military man who is a doctor versus a doctor who's in the military, and how that comes into conflict sometimes.
Yeah. I love the way the way he says it. It's so many people thought they could tell me what to do. He just he's almost charmed by it. So then Clete Roberts asks about what are the kind of people that you work with, and both Hawkeye and BJ and Colonel Potter make pains to talk about how great the nurses are. BJ says under every circumstance, bitter cold, horrendous heat, literally under the gun. And says Colonel Potter said they don't make nurses better anywhere. Maybe it's not the best way to phrase that. And then, of course, the button on it is competent.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, in the episode, we never got to hear any of the nurses interviewed because Margaret would be the one we would have interviewed, but she was off doing a play on Broadway during this point in the production, so she was not there. So she wasn't interviewed, which is a real shame that we didn't get Loretta Swit, her contributions to this, as far as I would have loved her improvisations and stuff. And Larry Gelbart, years later, did actually write a piece for Margaret that would have been part of this episode, or how he envisioned it being part of this episode, which was a fascinating read in and of itself. He also did other ones that wouldn't have been in this episode, Colonel Blake and Trapper, and who if how he envisioned them being interviewed by the Cleet Roberts character. But Margaret, to me, is the one that we really missed out on, without a doubt.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is 1975, and television production being what it was. Margaret was, Loretta Swit was off doing same time next year.
Yes.
Which, ironically enough, Alan Alda would end up doing as well. In the movie.
Yes.
But in television production being what it was in 1975, it was not easy to kind of get people back and forth the way it would be nowadays. But and of course, they didn't know it when they were filming this episode at the time. We know it in retrospect. But you look at it, you say, man, it's a darn shame they didn't recognize this one is going to leave a mark.
Yes.
You really got to get Loretta Swit in on this. Can we figure something out?
Right.
Can we build a tent in her dressing room,
right,
and shoot that, and just crowbar it in? Like,
well,
you
like
really don't
said,
want to have Margaret not be in this one.
No, and like you said, I mean, it was a one-shot piece. It wasn't like you were moving around. I mean, I would have hoped it, but again, like you said, that it was a different era. I mean, now they would have just green screened it and had a photo of her tent behind it, and it would have
done.
Had set the camera there, and like you said, on your off day, we're doing this and move on. Well, it wasn't that day. But I did want to read just a little portion, because we talked about the fact how they were mentioning the nurses, but we never got a female perspective in here. So there was one line that Larry Gelbart wrote for Margaret, and I'm just going to give you the interviewer question and what Margaret responded, because I love this. And the interviewer says, it's essentially a man's world, wouldn't you say, this business of war? And Gelbart had Margaret's response as, getting into them seems to be. which again, we get that female perspective on that note, to which I thought was funny. And I could see Loretta Swit delivering that perfectly too. I could see her nailing that.
Yeah, that's a great line. Yeah, it is a real shame that Margaret is not in this, because it does feel a little incomplete.
Yes,
Margaret,
great word for that, incomplete. Because
she just does, she just needs to be here. She missed out a lot of episodes in season 4, and again, it's very, very nice of the producers to let her off.
Absolutely.
Do the play. I mean, I could see a lot of maybe more hard asses saying, no, this is your first responsibility, is being here on the show.
I think you know better than I do, I'm sure, Rob. I think this was the last episode in which she did not appear.
Well, that's an interesting thought. I haven't really thought of it. You're probably right.
I think she appeared in every other episode after this.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Again, I'd have to go back but you're right. I mean, Hawkeye, the solo Hawkeye episode, we've already passed that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that might be it for this. Is after that, she's in every one. I mean, again, with the departure of Frank, she gets a lot more to do.
Right. On her own, especially.
Yeah, it was so funny when I think the first couple of times I ever watched this episode, I don't think I really noticed that she was gone. Not in any way as a slight to Loretta Swit, obviously, but this episode is so brilliant that you just don't. I don't know. You don't think about what's missing.
No, you're engaged.
Later,
you're
I'm
engaged.
like, oh wait,
yeah, you're engaged in what is there.
Yep.
Instead of what's not, because of how the episode was brilliantly constructed, conceived, and done. So
yeah, totally. So then Cleet Roberts asks Hawkeye about being at war, and he says, what about Ernest Hemingway and his reports from Madrid? And I love again Alan Alda has that warm kind of smile as Hawkeye, and he says, I used to love Hemingway because he wrote so well. And then his face kind of turns. But now that I'm here, I can't understand why anybody would willingly go to a war, would go with enthusiasm, would want to be there while it's happening. And he says, I'd do anything to get out of here. And, again, to me, that recalls the line that he said earlier about how we manufacture people like that, because there's a phrase that we have in the modern culture, which are like the keyboard brigade. Those are people that root on war, especially American war, but they themselves are never going to serve. But they're really happy to go online and tweet about it, and it's that kind of same thing of like, oh, yeah, war sounds great. Well, why don't you go over there and do it? Well, no, not me. Oh, yeah. Well, that's convenient, isn't it?
And I also think they sort of wrote in there a generational thing, too, about how, again, this was speaking really about the Vietnam War in Korea, but Colonel Potter had comments, too, about, well, when I started, I was in the cavalry. That was exciting.
Very romantic.
It was about this exciting, romantic. and how his generation viewed that differently than did the Vietnam generation.
Yep.
You know, that sort of excitement or glory type of thing just wasn't necessarily integral in that later generation as compared to what it would have been maybe in the first half, or, well, that was sort of the first half, but in the early part of the 20th century. And how even Potter, as you mentioned, had sort of changed his mind about that. Once he was there, maybe that excitement is a little bit dulled by all the other stuff that goes on there.
Yeah, completely. Then Clete Roberts asks everybody about heroes, and Hawkeye just says very dismissively, no, I don't have any heroes, which is very interesting because you would think that he would have named his father. He clearly really idolizes his father. And I almost think that Hawkeye is saying that to kind of make a point a little bit, just sort of like, I'm just sort of demoralized. No, I don't go for anything as romantic as having a hero.
Well, and again, I think, you thinking about the war era, you know, Eisenhower was a war hero, becomes president. You have all these people that were generals or in the war that were considered heroes. So to me, that's again illustrating that the people you think are heroes are not heroes to me, because I'm not in for this war thing.
Then Potter talks about Abraham Lincoln.
Yay!
And he says, yeah, your favorite. That's how you got into the network, was through Abraham Lincoln.
It was.
He talks about Abraham Lincoln, and he talks about the compassion that he had, and he says he would have been a great doctor. And then he talks about that these are, and Harry S. Truman. He says these are, you know, they made the decision. They didn't try and weasel the decision. Great. Again, another great turn of phrase, weasel the decision. And he says, and they did it, and they took responsibility for it. Again, we have to wonder what Colonel Potter would think of some of our modern leaders.
Yeah.
Living in a world where you had a president who literally said, I don't take responsibility for it. You're like,
and that was a striking line for me too, about the taking responsibility. They made a decision and they understood that, and he mentioned Truman as well. Buck stops here as being a hero of his, of taking that responsibility and not trying to pass it off or just not accept it or deny it or whatever. I did have to mention too about Potter when he was talking about that too. He had mentioned about, again, sort of this idea of the heroes of Douglas Fairbank and Francis X. Bushman. Well, that was a piece of trivia. Francis X. Bushman was Harry Morgan's wife's grandfather.
That's right.
And Bushman was a silent film star, and he was in Ben-Hur. And in a lot of
original.
Things like that. Yeah, the original, the silent version of Ben-Hur, not the Charlton Heston Ben-Hur. But so I just love that, how they weave little things like that in too. I just love this episode for things like that as well.
Yeah, it's good. If you
I like silent films. You know,
that's right.
We also did Wings on Film and Water.
Film and Water. That's right. And then Frank asks, he's asked about what does he think about General Eisenhower, and he just goes, "Well, he's a general." And I love that Frank has no insight, no thought. It's rank. That's all he knows. Well, of course I respect him. He's a general. I have no opinion of my own, but it's only because he's that's his only observation, is that he's a general. Yeah, well, no shit, Frank.
Well, I wrote note. I think he asked him, "What do you think of President Eisenhower?" And he says he's a general, which again, for the exact reasons you said, which was a Frankism, without a doubt. Well, president, so what? He was a general.
Yeah.
But the other thing was, this is one of those fuzzy MASH timeline things, because at the beginning, he says, we're in the second year of the war, Clete Roberts says. But Eisenhower really didn't become president until into the third year of the war. And he was inaugurated in 1953.
And in the very previous episode we just covered, Deluge, Harry Truman is still president. They talk about it there, even though Eisenhower is president during the late Captain Pierce episode, the beginning of season 4. So they did not keep that straight at all.
No, which you've mentioned so many times in the past. But I just thought, that as Rob always said, they're a little fast and loose sometimes with the timeline or chronology of where things go there.
Yeah, you would think being able to keep track of the presidents would be easy enough to do, but okay. I mean,
but I guess the whole point of what they were saying, they just decided took precedence over little things like that.
Yeah, I don't have to worry about it. Radar talks about, I love Gary Berghoff's take where he talks about meeting some of the Korean locals, and he says, sometimes we just have enough to ourselves, like penicillin, and he says, I really wish some people would tell back home this. And when you have to look these kids in the face, that's where it's really at. And I love that he almost is brought to tears That's where the ball game really is, when you have to look these kids in the face here. And again, it's like the idea that really bothers Radar, that he can't help other people. A very Radar kind of gesture that bothers him, that he can't help the locals. And it's the way Gary Berghoff's voice kind of goes up. I'm doing an awful version of it, but his voice gets up a little higher. You can tell that he's getting genuinely upset having to even discuss it.
In that, and to kind of tie into that, that was one of the things that when Gelbart wrote that interview for Margaret, they asked a question and she makes a comment about when you have to look down into the face of the soldier on the table, and you have to have this barrier where you're operating on them. But she said, but you also remember there's someone's dad or someone's father or someone's son. They're a person that's in this situation, and how moving that is, and the weight that you have to carry because of that. And again, sort of that idea of asking people back home to not forget what these people are sacrificing here. And they're people. They're not just soldiers. They're people. They're somebody's, again, brother, father, son, whatever.
Frank is asked about who he misses back home. And initially, he's stuck for an answer. And then he finally realized, my family, of course. And they're my strength, which is, And then he releases the wonderful Beaumont. I believe that marriage is the headstone of American society.
Yes. Perhaps cornerstone would have been a better word, Frank. But the word headstone totally is in your character.
It's completely, yes. That's exactly a Frank Burns kind of thing. Hawkeye talks about that he misses bacon frying and pancakes, the smell of bacon in the morning. Been a long time since I smelled that. Potter mentions his family. BJ mentions, his wife. And Klinger talks about, Klinger talks about Toledo again. And then Radar talks about he wants to see his mom.
Yeah,
that's what he talks about. And he says he's got this 41 Chevy that he's fixing up. A neighbor swapped me from one of our pregnant sows.
Yeah. And then he said, it takes however long to get to the TV. It's 1 hour by foot and 2 hours by car. Yeah. He said by that 41 Ford.
That's a marvelous joke. I just love that. 1 hour by foot, 2 hours by car. Clete Robert asks everyone to say hello to someone back home,
which I think, to me, I'll let you go, but I want to say, to me, each of those people's bits was a total encapsulation of their character within a few lines.
Yes,
I thought those bits were so good by who it was they wanted to address back home and how they wanted to address it was their character right there. Just a perfect big guy.
Yeah, I love that BJ looks right in the camera and talks to his wife. Hello, darling, I miss you. And then he gets immediately embarrassed.
Embarrassed and almost like moved by that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And then Radar says, I miss you and I love you. Is this too personal?
Yeah.
Is this too personal? Potter he says, there is someone, but I just don't think that's dignified. So I won't do it.
The commanding officer.
Officer. And then Frank has the line about, I don't have to say hello. I know how everyone feels about me. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we all know how everyone feels too, Frank.
Yeah. And then
and
Hawkeye,
he's so oblivious again, in his character.
Yeah, exactly. Hawkeye decides, instead of saying hello to his dad, he decides to address Harry Truman and wonders why Bess has not written him back yet.
Yep, the sarcastic comment right there. That's him. Yep.
I think I always
and sort of anti-authoritarian in its own way too.
Right. Yeah. I always assumed that they were Hawkeye was sort of cheekily saying that he's written kind of like dirty letters.
Yeah. I got the impression of that. Yeah. Well, I think that's what didn't Robertson says. Well, I think it's because she's so moved. She just hasn't, hadn't taken the time to respond yet.
I love that he goes along with it. Maybe she's too much to respond. No, I don't. No, I don't think that's it. I don't think she likes me. I love that's great. And then he asks him, "Do you think that each one of them are you going to see these people again?" And BJ talks about that he would love to. He loves the people, but he also wants to erase everything about this place. And then Potter gets a little wistful and talks about how that he's very close to some of these people, and he hopes he'll keep in contact with them. And then Clete Roberts follows up and says, "Do you think you will?" And that's when he kind of puts his head down and he says, well, I'm not too sure about that.
Yeah.
Which is, again, I love that. I love that idea of being very realistic, saying, yeah, you probably will, but things change when you go home.
Well, and I also think it was not all of us are going to make it out of here.
Oh, I didn't even take it.
Maybe I will, maybe I won't. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And, like you said, and then in addition to the part that things may change, not everyone comes home.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That had never occurred to me. That was the read on it. But yes, of course, because you can't assume necessarily in a war zone that everybody's going to get out of this. So, yeah. And then Cleet does a bit from the pre-op where he talks about the enemy, which likes to attack at dawn, did just that. And he's kind of pushed out of the way by Radar carrying a litter. And then we see everybody operating, and that's the end of Act 2. And then we go back for the bumper, which was some voiceover where Hawkeye says, a war is like when it rains in New York and everybody crowds into doorways and everybody huddles together. They get chummy, perfect strangers, except in a war, there are people, it's raining on the street, and the people who are chummy over there are trying to kill the people over here who are chums. And then there's just a series of little bits from everybody. There's Potter reiterating where he says, these guys aren't soldiers, they're doctors. BJ says, I'm a terribly misassigned civilian. Klinger says, they give back life. Can you do better? And then Radar does that really where somebody would tell the people back home this. And then Mulcahy says, somehow, I just pray somehow that it will all make sense. And then we end with Hawkeye saying, it's crazy. And the final shot of the episode, strangely enough, we see our 4 doctors, and then there's a extra running by, and the camera stops as they're practically filling the screen in a blur. And it's a very, very unusual way to end the show. But again, it gives it that verisimilitude that's what a documentary footage would look like. It's not a pretty shot.
Right.
It's chaotic and weird and even kind of unattractive looking that this extra is blocking the screen away from our stars.
And that was my thought exactly. I'm sure they said, when you look back, it would all be a blur. Some things I remember, some things I don't, because it was so chaotic, so crazy. So in the parlance of the production, hard cut stuff. Your memories probably are almost hard cut at some point too.
And said it's just an amazing episode. It's MASH really trusting its audience to follow along and to be okay with this hard change of format. I mean, again, as I said in the previous episode with Deluge, they're kind of priming the audience a little bit in that episode with the intercutting of the documentary footage, the intercutting of the newsreel footage. So they were maybe kind of getting you ready for this kind of interesting, editing choices and interesting directorial style. But this is jumping into the pool neck deep. And it really is the perfect melding of sort of the art, the behind the camera part of it, the setting up the structure, and then allowing the actors the room to come up with these brilliant observations. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite observations of all time shortly. But it's such a trusting of the actors, and it's something that, I don't know, you couldn't have really done in season 2. Not that McLean Stevenson or Wayne Rogers could not have handled it, but just the show needed extra time to grow and to deepen, and it needed almost all of season 4 with its experiments.
Right.
With the Quo Vadis Captain Chandler and the Hawkeye episode and Deluge, to kind of get the audience ready that we're going to try and bust the form a little bit, and now we're really going to shatter it with this episode.
Right, exactly. And again, like you said, they also engendered the trust of the network. Yeah. Like we talked about before. They built a lot of trust up, through their 4 seasons. They couldn't have done that in season 1, season 2, season 3.
Yeah.
This had to be here, and at the end of season 4, also, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It's so impressive that MASH is, willing is not talking down to you. It's asking you to lean in a little bit and really follow along. And it's just over time, its legend has only grown. Yes. There were articles. There was an article in the AV Club, but like not even all that long ago, just about like maybe 5-10 years ago, mentioning this episode. And of course, now with modern television, you've got shows like The Office and Modern Family that did the documentary. Yes. I mean, everyone's used to it now.
And this episode, even amongst MASH episodes, this one really holds up. Like it is almost timeless to me because of that. Because we're familiar with sort of a structure like that now, that documentarian type thing, but it just holds up so well to me as I watch it. Again, I watched it twice, I think, again in prep for this, and having not seen it for a while, I watched it twice again, and it engaged me. I sat there and I heard things I didn't hear before, even though I'd heard them many times, and look at things different. You can still watch it, and I have other shows and other episodes of shows that I love. I would put among my favorite of all time. But this one in particular, for me, still holds up just as well as the first time I saw it, if not better. Whereas some, you see them the first time, they're great, and then maybe over time, there's things that this one held up for me.
Yeah, completely. And it moves very fast.
Yes, it
Considering
does.
that it is just all talking heads, it's over before you know it. I think just because all the observation and the editing, the rhythm of the editing, the fact that they were cutting between everybody back and forth, and the questions are so interesting.
And again, that technique fit right in with the construction of the episode, what they were trying to do, which, again, we're so used to seeing these things now, but that was so unusual at that time for television, scripted, so to speak, weekly television.
I would love to see, and I've mentioned this in other episodes, like I would love to see some MASH reruns with like the original commercials still in there. And it's like, can you imagine watching something like this with it's these sort of really trenchant observations and then cutting away to like Rice-A-Roni ads, like just the jarring nature of it. This had to be so strange of like, oh, okay, let's let's sell you some Virginia Slims in between, Hawkeye talking about, at least he could have called me a son of a bitch. He's done it for others, Meanwhile, here's a word from Westinghouse.
Well, what you're saying is exactly for me why I think it holds up so well too, because I grew up like you. I was a child in the 70s, and I remember those TV shows, and I loved them, and I can watch them now. What they don't do is make me think. Mm-hmm. I can watch them. This can still make me think, and it does. It is set apart, and it would have been a very, very different thing from the ads at that time, which were mostly constructed to, even if you had a drama, it was Kojak. I mean, it's a procedural, it's not like it's where you're really engaged in a cognitive process and thinking through things and multiple plot lines. And it wasn't like that, like many shows are now. It was just pretty straightforward. This still makes you think, and it made you think, and it still makes you think.
Yeah. As far as I know how television advertising works, I know that advertisers don't really buy time in specific episodes. They just sort of buy blocks where they say, I want to buy time in this and time in that. But I have to wonder if some of the material that MASH dealt with and in some of the formats, I have to wonder if some of the advertisers were like, let's not do that one. Can we buy time in Mary Tyler Moore? Let's do that. Let's not do MASH this week. Wait a minute. There's no script for this one? Nah, let's not do this one.
We'll hold off here.
CBS can run some promos or something. It's a brilliant episode. And to me, it's so brilliant that, again, as I mentioned, the 30th anniversary special, they devote like a chunk of the special to just this episode.
Yeah.
Most of the other shows just kind of get grouped in a larger sense of like, oh yeah, let's talk about the seasons. But then there's a couple that they pick out, and this is one of the ones they pick out to specifically talk about because it was so memorable. And in fact, it was so memorable that they couldn't quite resist not doing a sequel. And of course, in season 7, they did Our Finest Hour, which was a clip show, but they framed it with bringing Clete Roberts back and interviewing the actors once again. And this time, Loretta Swit did get involved, and so did David Ogden Stiers. But that's how good the idea was, that they couldn't resist trying it one more time.
Yeah, and again, I don't know if they knew that it would work as well as it did, but like you said, it had to be brought back. I've got a question for you. You and I have talked about before about this idea of being MASH as a comedy with dramatic beats, or is it really a drama with comedic beats? And where do you feel this episode fits into that, and how?
Yeah, I would say by season 4, MASH is a drama with comedy.
Totally agree.
Yeah,
and to me that's emphasized by the fact there was no laugh track, and how there were comedic beats. I mean, Frank's stuff was funny.
Mm.
Some of Hawkeye's stuff was funny. There was funny stuff in there, but to me, this was a dramatic episode, without a doubt.
Yeah, MASH hit so many heavy topics, especially this season, that you could argue it was a half-hour drama with some comedy in it. The show would kind of morph its way back into more comedy in later seasons, but for season 4 at least, they were really leaning heavily on the drama. Now, despite all that, I do have to ask you, Scott, what your favorite line or joke was from this episode.
You mentioned my favorite, and I don't know why I found this so hilarious, but I just did, and it was, and I think it was the line itself, but how it was delivered, and it was, I firmly believe that marriage is the headstone of American society. And then he was just so serious about that. I laughed out loud. I've seen that 100 times, and this time, that was the one that just got me, and I laughed out loud because it was just so Frank being oblivious as he's messing around with Margaret, still in this season 4, but he's saying how, everyone knows how they feel about me, and, marriage is such an important thing in American society. It's just Frank encapsulated. It was hilarious to me.
Yeah, Linville just just such a great job.
He just nailed it. I mean, every time on his things, he nailed it.
Yeah, it's unreal. My favorite line is from Alan Alda, where he is asked if he brought any creature comforts with him. And Hawkeye says, the dictionary. I figure it's got all the other books in it. I remember being like, there's no way Alan Alda came up with that line, because that line feels eternal. It is so brilliant, so like almost Dada in its, it's like Church of the Subgenius kind of thing.
Yeah.
That I just couldn't believe, as much as Alan Alda is brilliant, and we know that he is, I just couldn't believe that line did not just exist in the culture and Hawkeye just borrowed it. And that line is funny because, of course, you're like, yeah, of course it. I mean, it doesn't. Of course, it doesn't have all the other books in it, but it also kind of does too.
It has all the words.
It has all the words in it.
All the
books. But that might make back when I had my MASH blog, I would do the bit about my favorite line, and I mentioned this was my favorite line, and I wrote that line is so brilliant. I almost can't believe that Alan Alda or Larry Gelbart wrote it. It seems like something that just existed in the culture, and that inspired no less than Larry Gelbart to come on my blog and leave a comment about what I wrote. And I can remember when I posted that one day, all of a sudden, because I would get little notifications, and it would say, you've got a new comment. And it would say, you've got a new comment from Larry Gelbart. And I would, what?
Your jaw hit floor. Yeah.
And Larry Gelbart was very nice. And he said, in fact, Alan Alda came up with that line. That is Alan Alda's. And I'm like, that is so crazy brilliant that it makes me think of Alan Alda in a whole new way. I mean, I already love the guy, but just the fact that he came up with
and like you said, to me, I've heard that before. I remember people saying that when I was in school, but it came from there apparently. Because
from MASH.
In my time and your time frame, we used to watch MASH. It was on every day. It was either on right after the nightly news or right before it when I was growing up, or both perhaps. So we watched MASH every night at my house, every single night. The reruns, every night we watched it. So I'm sure that filtered into my lexicon as well. And I never thought about the fact that it wasn't just always around. And that's fantastic.
Yeah,
that Larry Gelbart cleared it up on your blog, which is even better. I mean, that's awesome.
I could not believe that Larry Gelbart even bothered to read my little blog. And he actually provided a second piece of information, is that he did mention Loretta Swit was off doing a play. That's why she's not in the show. So I'm like, oh, wow. And I mean, that's the only interaction I ever had with him, but I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe that even for one moment, Larry Gelbart had time in his day to read my stupid rumblings about MASH.
How did we know that Hollywood Rob Kelly was going to strike even that early on? Those were just the signs.
Oh, my Lord. I just can't believe it. So not only do I think the line is just so crazy brilliant, but the fact that it instigated an interaction between me and Larry Gelbart is just, I'm like, I'll never forget it. I mean, it's just like one of the great, sort of like fan moments of my life. So
all that kind of reminds me of my other favorite line here too. I want to say, and you had mentioned it also before, when BJ said he was a temporarily reassigned civilian.
Right.
I loved how he used sort of that reassigned, a military phraseology to describe himself as a civilian. There's just something I loved about that too.
Yeah. I mean, he said it's like, yeah, I'm a captain technically, but I'm not really.
Yeah, not really.
Yeah. I said it's just the show is so altogether brilliant and so, again, as Larry Gilbert said, artful in its artlessness that you just
yes,
you're sort of almost dumbfounded. You know, you're just like, I can't believe a sitcom would do this and pull it, and not only try it but pull it off so brilliantly and wrap the season up with it on top of it. Like, you know, to not even like hold your hand and maybe give you like a more traditional episode on the way out the door, but to kind of like really, you know, like, you know, leave the knife in the wall and then just walk out and like, see you people in September. You know?
Well, and for Larry Gelbart, it was mic drop.
Oh,
I mean, it was, I'm not back. And he didn't, Gene Reynolds sort of came back, his, you know, creative consultant. He had different roles.
Yep.
Larry Gelbart was it. That was it.
Yep.
He didn't write anymore, didn't direct anymore, did not creatively, was not involved with it anymore. And he talked about that in an interview too, where he said, my thing was, I didn't know to do anything but too much. And I wouldn't be back in that role. I was ready to do other things, and I was going to put everything into that. And again, so like you said, mic drop. And sort of that was an add-on episode that was kind of one of those ideas we've been milling around for a while. And it's bam.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine that after you've written this, what's there to write?
Yeah.
You know, like you're like, what am I going to come up with after this? You know, what's there left for me to do? So yeah, I could see why you would just be like, yeah, I think I'm done at this point. It's just unbelievable. So it's a completely brilliant episode. It's one of the, you know, certainly a great way to end the season. I think MASH generally had very good season enders. They kind of really worked on it to one. I mean, obviously last season was Abyssinia Henry. So they were kind of priming the audience for really getting a kick in the shins.
Yep.
As the shows wrap the season up.
Yeah.
So it's just a terrific show. And, I mean, Scott, I'm always happy to have you on and talk MASH, but it's really fun now kind of wrapping up the seasons with you. So thank you once again for coming by and wrapping up MASHcast season 4 with me.
I always enjoy doing it. I'm looking forward to next season and the upcoming seasons too.
Oh, my Lord.
Says Rob, who does 50 podcasts, and Scott X, who guest stars on a couple.
Committing me to another whole season.
Yeah, exactly. Well, because we'll talk about that off air, but you know I have a couple that I still have a couple itches that I need to have scratched with MASH on there too.
That's right. In the meantime, why don't you tell people where they can find you out on the internet?
Well, I have appeared here on the Fire and Water Podcast Network on a number of shows, in addition to this one, including Midnight the Podcasting Hour, the Film and Water Podcast, Give Me That Star Trek, Fire and Water Team Up, Power Records Podcast, JLI Bwahaha Podcast, and Fade Out. I've also appeared on an episode of DC OCD with Paul Hicks and Mike Garvey, which was loads of fun. Beyond that, you can find me on Twitter. I'm usually spamming up someone's feed on Saturday nights. I'm watching Sven Dooley and doing a little bit of riff tracks sort of with that, which I find lots of fun. And for those interested, Rob joins us every now and again and contributes to all the fun. So that's where you can find me on Twitter. At some point, I'm going to do a little bit more content on there. I have some thoughts and ideas, but it's just, as always, it's a competition for time, which, Rob, I know you understand so well.
Oh, yeah, I can understand that. So, wait, you did a podcast that's not part of the Fire and Water Podcast Network?
Yes,
is that what you're doing?
Yes, only one. Only one. Apparently, you guys are the only ones that will have me, and I'm very proud of that. So
this is very awkward, Scott. We're going to have to talk about this one. Sorry about that. So, yeah, again, thank you once again, Scott. I really do appreciate it. So, of course, if you want to find all the back episodes of this show, go to our website, fireandwaterpodcast.com. You can subscribe to MASHcast on any podcatcher of your choice. We're always talking MASH over on Twitter at MASH477cast. And if you want to support the Fire and Water Podcast Network, just go to patreon.com/FWPodcast, and there you can unlock various rewards. One of which is to be name checked on a show of your choice. So a big salute as we wrap up season 4 to Nicholas Prom, Russell Burbage, Stan Peel, Britt Schramm, Mike Thomas, Michael Porter, and new patron, Joe Perino. You managed to get it in just under the wire, Joe. I very much appreciate it. But, of course, as I said, this is the final traditional episode of MASHcast for season 4. I will be back in a couple of weeks with the normal MASHcast mail call. We'll read some mail over the course of the previous season. I will rank the season 4 episodes. That's going to be tough. That's going to be really tough because there's a lot of good shows, but I'm going to try and do it. And we'll, kind of tie up some other loose odds and ends as we wrap up season 4. And I will, of course, make the official announcement asking about guests for season 5. But wait until the mail call episode comes out in a couple of weeks. We will get it in then, everybody.
Rob doesn't want another deluge. That's not an episode title. He doesn't want that quite yet.
Woo! Hey, I'm very fortunate that the people like this show. They listen to it. They comment about it. And I have more guests than I can find space for in any given season. That is a problem to have when you are a podcaster. And I'm very, very, very fortunate that so many people enjoy this show the way they do, and they want to be part of it. It means the world to me. And I always feel bad that not everybody can be involved in any given season because we just have there's only 24 shows. But again, yeah, we'll make the official announcement in a couple of weeks about season 5. So stay tuned, everybody. Just wait a couple of weeks, and the mail call episode will show up. But that's really going to do it for the episode recaps for MASHcast. So yeah, that's good.
I think we got to go. I hear the choppers.
Yeah, we got to get out of here. Absolutely. So again, until the mail call episode, that is all.
Some of their saltier comments have been deleted.
Savings starts with Xfinity. Get a great price on Xfinity Internet. Plus, ask how to get an eligible 5G phone on us. And for a limited time, $300 back when you add Xfinity Mobile. Go to Xfinity.com/start saving. Call 1-800-XFINITY or visit a store today. Restrictions apply.
Switching to Geico is a good idea, especially when you consider everything.
First off, Geico makes it easy to switch. They have licensed agents available 24/7 online or over the phone.
But if it's so easy, you might start thinking everything is easy, even big wave surfing. And it's not. It's actually quite difficult.
Well, if you switch to Geico, you could save hundreds on car insurance. And you could keep saving by bundling your motorcycle, boat, and RV, plus your home or renter's insurance.
But saving money might lead you to make some questionable purchases, like a 20-foot feather boa. And do you know how hard it is to clean a 20-foot feather boa?
Well, they do have an industry-leading mobile app you can use to pay your bill, file and manage a claim, or add a new driver.
But when life gets a little easier, it makes you too confident. And you start calling everyone Ace. And you're better than that.
Well, Geico has a 97% customer satisfaction rating and has been saving people money for 85 years. It's hard to beat that.
But you're right.
Switch to Geico. It's obviously a good idea.